This year keeps getting more and more interesting with so many unexpected entries into the handheld gaming market. I would have never guessed the Valve Steamdeck to be a thing, but here it is challenging the likes of the Neo, GPD devices, and even the Switch. But how does it compare to one of the best, the Onexplayer? Finally, let's look at the most interesting part, the specifications. But before that, be sure to check out the links in the description and the comments section if you fancy taking a look at either device yourself. Anyway, specs. The Steamdeck relies on an AMD Zen 2 CPU of some description, but the specifics are not fully disclosed, although what we do know is that it'll have 4 cores and 8 threads, which is exactly half as much as the Xbox Series S has. What that equates to is a frequency of anywhere between 2.4 to 3.5 GHz, which is actually really good for playing games on a portable device. Bear in mind the screen is 7 inches and isn't fully HD, so you're not going to be playing with crazy amped up graphics, so performance should never be an issue anyway. On the topic of graphics, we also know that the GPU will be a RDNA too. Suffice to say that's more than enough to get by gaming on 720p, so there's not much to be said on that front. On top of that, it also has a generous 16GB of LPDDR5 RAM, which is great for 2 reasons. Firstly, that's a lot of RAM for such a small device. And secondly, the fact that it's LPDDR RAM rather than just DDR RAM means that it'll consume less power and therefore aid towards a longer battery life. Hence why it can last up to 8 solid hours of gaming. When it comes to storage, there are 3 SSD options, ranging from 64GB at $400 up to 512GB for $650. I'll give you a little spoiler, that's a whole lot cheaper than the Onexplayer. But is the Onex just a better device? Well, at $1,400 for the higher end model and $1,200 for the standard model, it's kind of hard to argue because is any handheld really worth that amount of money? The cheaper model is running an Intel Core i5 11th gen and a terabyte of SSD space, but for sake of value, I'll compare the higher end model. That one runs an Intel Core i7 11th generation, which is pretty incredible because that's the sort of CPU you'd expect to find in a relatively high-end laptop. It's unlikely that whatever AMD Zen 2 CPU that the Steamdeck has will be able to compete with that, especially considering it has a frequency of 4.8 GHz. GPU is less impressive as it's only an Intel Iris X3. But similarly to the Steamdeck, the need for a killer GPU isn't necessary due to the nature of the screen being too small to be able to display massively high resolutions. Moving past that, the Onex also has 16GB of LPDDR4 RAM, which is actually no better than the Steamdeck. But then it also has 2TB of SSD space, which equates to roughly 4 times as much as 512GB model of the Steamdeck. When all hardware inside the Onex is taken into consideration, it's actually a remarkably powerful device for such a small form factor. In fact, in Overwatch, the Onex experienced between 65 to 84 frames per second, which is really stable for such a demanding online game. Red Dead Redemption 2 experienced similar FPS at 60 to 73 frames, so suffice to say, it's a more than capable handheld for any AAA game. Although admittedly these FPS readings were taken on low settings, so how it would perform on higher settings is anyone's guess. Regardless, the Steamdeck is probably not able to reach those numbers in the same games based on the hardware, although Valve has stated that it can run the entire Steam library at a bare minimum of 30 FPS, hinting towards the fact that it can run most games somewhere above that mark. So spec-wise, the Onex wins by a pretty fair margin. Aside from the RAM and then the GPU, which is less relevant in this case, the Onex has a pretty meaty CPU, which will be very difficult to compete with, and the storage options are also considerably larger. It should also be noted that the Onex's screen has a resolution of 2304 by 1296 pixels, compared to the Steamdeck's kind of awkward 1280 by 800 resolution. This means that the Onex has twice the PPI density, so it'll look more crisp in general. Though with such a small screen, the difference between the two devices will be marginal. Specifications are a losing battle for the Steam Deck because it's cheaper. That's okay though, because I'd argue it's better value. But either way, looking past the specs, a big question is how fun does each device actually feel to use? In terms of the design, the Steam Deck definitely goes for a more retro sort of look, which, depending on your preference, can be either very nostalgic or very ugly. But regardless, it is pretty ergonomic despite the square design. The handles are well curved and lead into an additional 4 triggers on the back, which allow you to have more control over your movement in games. The OneXplayer doesn't have that option, but rather the standard amount of triggers you'd expect on a controller. So props to Valve for thinking of that one. It's also notable that the thumbsticks are not diagonally placed like the One X, but are horizontal. The reason for that is because of these square trackpads underneath on either side, which add a similar function to that of the PS4's DualSense controller. Whether or not that'll actually be a useful feature or a waste of space is up to you as the user, because I'm not sure everyone will be eager to use them. Personally, I don't like trackpads because I find them to be too fiddly, so for me, I'd rather have the diagonal thumbsticks instead, like on the One X. But of course, that is subjective. Comfort is relative to a lot of physical factors, but I see the trackpads as being a source of thumb cramping. However, I can vouch for the placement of the ABXY buttons being next to the thumbsticks because that's just a more accessible place in my opinion. But again, I still prefer the whole layout of the One X's controls since they're more natural. It's also a bigger device with a larger 8.4-inch screen compared to the 7-inch one on the Steam Deck. For obvious reasons, I do think the bigger the screen, the better to an extent. 8.4 inches is the perfect balance between portability and usability. The differences don't stop there though, because the functionality of both the OneXplayer and the Steam Deck are actually pretty different. While the One X runs full-fledged Windows 10, the Steam Deck opted for its own Steam OS. Of course, the option to install Windows onto the Steam Deck is always there, but from my perspective, the Steam OS is way nicer than Windows 10 for a handheld. Windows was made for PCs, which means it's a pretty intricate operating system. With the One X, it can often get fiddly at times, which is annoying, but at the same time, it also opens up more freedom compared to the Steam OS. With the Steam Deck's own operating system, it's more like a personalized experience, and not to mention the fact that it's set up specifically for this device, so the overall usability will be way better. From my perspective, the vast majority of games are already on Steam, so the need for Windows 10 isn't strictly necessary, although I can see why it's useful. For the case of the OneXplayer, it actually has the ability to be connected up to multiple external monitors as well as an eGPU to boost gaming performance and turn it into a full-on gaming PC. Just because that's such a cool feature, I can't really fault it. But still, I think Steam OS is more convenient. So, what's the verdict then? Well, I'll start off by saying that the high-end OneXplayer will cost you over double what the high-end Steam Deck costs. That's a big difference, which is why I think the Steam Deck is without a doubt the better value device. It offers a crisp experience with a fluid operating system that houses pretty much every single game and performs really well since all games hit a minimum benchmark of 30 FPS. It's enough to satisfy and at half the cost. However, if you want a more hardcore gaming experience that feels more close to PC gaming, then the OneXplayer will be better. Not only does it outdo the Steam Deck greatly when it comes to specifications, but it also runs Windows and can be converted into a desktop PC. If you have the cash for it and you know what you want, then absolutely go for it. But in general, I have to say that with bang for buck considered, I do think that the Steam Deck is the better device. Anyway, what do you think? Check the comments and the description to check out the links to both the handhelds. Be sure to like and subscribe.